Yes.
So, are you also interested in finding out what other witnesses had to say?
Yes. To look in the mirror and not be able to look in the mirror.
And started work in October. But as soon as the grand jury was ready to disband, judges have complained that this case hasn't been able to go to the next step, the next level, move away from them as suspects to intruders. And I'll say this to the Ramseys, until they produce, well, it's who's heard it, who hasn't heard it. 6 people have, and the fact is that
if you look closely, you can see the Ramsey housekeeper, Linda Hoffman-Pugh, is holding up a little placard, a little poster, if you will, with Patsy's handwriting on the one side and the ransom note on the other side. Who do you think the Ramsey housekeeper believes wrote the ransom note?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. If you think about it, the ransom note more than suggests its author has a gripe with John. Even John supported this notion, imagining the perpetrator had a grudge to be someone with perhaps a disaffected ex-employee. John Ramsey also often cites John Douglas as saying someone really had a bone to pick with you. Not those words, but basically someone was angry at you. Now, the overly familiar references to John as a fat cat and that he should use his common sense and don't grow a brain, was there actually some truth to these insults? I mean, closer to home. If Patsy wrote the note, was she expressing something that she really felt in the note? It's in this sense that we wade into the next section of Linda Hoffman-Pugh's book. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I've had a look at the stats. They have improved, but almost 60% of you who are watching that are not subscribed. Now, what do you think? Are you enjoying this analysis? Do you find it worthwhile? Well, if you do, those 60% who are not subscribed, please do hit the subscribe button. I hear a lot of people saying, well, I didn't actually know I wasn't subscribed. Now it might be a good time to check. Does it say they're subscribed? If it doesn't, please click on that button. If you're finding my analysis particularly meaningful, particularly informative, you can also hit the thanks button and let's get started. So this is really a continuation of part 2 of the previous analysis dealing with the Ramsey housekeeper's book, or certainly the beginnings of one. Now, although we need to be careful to accept the substance of her writings as fact, I think it's okay if one weighs the substance as if it's generally, if not specifically, true. Does that make sense? The other thing is, bear in mind that the housekeeper did testify to the grand jury, and you would imagine that that does give her some credibility. They wouldn't have asked her to testify if they didn't think that she had something to contribute, and she testified for 8 hours. So what I want you to do is, if the housekeeper talks about the marriage being in trouble and offers specific examples, we don't necessarily have to accept the specifics in order to consider, weigh, evaluate the overall concept. Does that make sense? Now, on the flip side, we also need to be cautious being too dismissive of the housekeeper's insights. After all, they likely played a part in convincing the same grand jury that there wasn't an intruder. In this sense, I think Linda Hoffman-Pugh was possibly the prosecution's strongest witness in terms of building their case against the Ramseys. And after we've dealt with the housekeeper, we are going to deal with what the grand jurors said of the testimony they heard. So look out for that. And that brings us to 5 terrific insights, 5 more terrific insights from the Ramsey housekeeper. Number 1, the housekeeper testified about trouble in paradise to the grand jury at length. We've already mentioned that she mentioned this, but she testified at length about it, and this is her writing about it. Now, I do think what elevates the housekeeper's opinion on this matter, the matter of the Ramsey marriage, is that it actually came up during the grand jury trial. You know, she actually testified about it under oath to the grand jury. Let's listen to what she says. Quote, "Remarkably, Patsy seemed genuinely upset by John's criticism. This is regarding her being a lousy housemaker and cook. And Patsy was more emotional than I think I've ever seen her. Now, what we would really like to know is when this comment was actually made. Later, when appearing before the Boulder grand jury investigating the murder of JonBenet Ramsey, I spoke at length about the trouble I thought the Ramsey marriage was experiencing. Now, we know that the housekeeper said that she'd worked for the Ramseys for 14 months. And her work ended essentially when JonBenet died, which means that this comment about Patsy being a lousy homemaker and cook very likely happened sometime in 1996. Notice also the words "at length." I spoke at length about the trouble I thought their marriage was experiencing. This suggests the housekeeper's allegations aren't just a case of mudslinging for money. There may actually be some merit to them if she spoke about it in a court of law. She goes on to say, quote, I told the grand jury that in my opinion, based on my personal observations while working for them, I could honestly say that the Ramseys did not appear to be a happily married couple. On the contrary, they seemed held together like lots of other unhappy marriages by their children. Now, one thing I've always noticed, that's always stood out to me is that on Christmas Day, John Ramsey disappeared for something like 2 or 3 hours. He said he went to the airport. But of all days to not need to go somewhere, and then he actually went somewhere. I've often wondered whether he actually went to work that day, whether he was actually at his office in Pearl Street. Anyway, she goes on to write, without their son Burke and their daughter JonBenet, it is my belief that John and Patsy would have divorced many years ago. Now, obviously, that's her opinion. Is she right? Well, it's hard to say. It could be that if she is right, that Patsy feared John was going to divorce her, and then when JonBenet died, that fear kicked up a gear. You know, and what if they lost Burke in the process? After JonBenet died, what if they lost Burke as well? It's difficult not to imagine that part of the rationale for writing the ransom note wasn't just to protect a certain individual, but perhaps, if Patsy wrote it, perhaps that was all about fighting to save her marriage. John was married to his first wife, Lucinda Pash. He married her in 1978. They were married for 12 years. His marriage to Patsy, which occurred in 1980, was at the 16-year mark in 1996. And Patsy was a kind of trophy wife, if you think about it, like a beauty queen trophy wife. She was about to turn 40. In fact, she was turning 40 that December. Anyway, it's just interesting thinking about this as a possible motive if Patsy wrote the ransom note beyond what we tend to think about. Now, John, whether innocent or not in all this, also had all the incentive in the world to fight for his business and to keep his job at Lockheed. Obviously, a year later, he didn't have that job at Lockheed. Number 2, Patsy was an oddball. That's according to the housekeeper. She writes, I also told the grand jury that while Patsy could be kind and even thoughtful, she was one of the strangest people I have ever met. By way of example, I told the grand jury that while cleaning out and organizing her vast number of purses, one of my tasks every Friday, Patsy took me aside and explained that she had gone to a local church, had members of her congregation pray over her, and the next day found that doctors had declared her miraculously cured of stage 4 ovarian cancer. Now, if the housekeeper was turned off by Patsy's fervent faith, it seemed to turn some people on, in a sense. Lou Smith, for one. Some of the district attorney's office, for another. Smith apparently sat in his car and prayed prior to starting the investigation each day. John Ramsey apparently prayed at Smith's bedside. Is that right? When he passed, and didn't Lou Smith visit Patsy during her last days in hospital? Anyway, the housekeeper goes on to say, but that wasn't all. Patsy also had visions. She confided in me that John's deceased daughter, Beth, from his first marriage, appeared before her to tell her that an angel was coming to cure her of cancer. Patsy believed her dead stepdaughter's message was true, and that the angel sent her cancer into remission, along with the help of the parishioners of her church who had prayed over her. Now, faith can be an important ally in the hopeless minefield that one can find oneself in when cancer strikes. And it did seem to work for Patsy. But this oddness and strong faith, doesn't it reflect to some extent in the ransom note as well? I mean, the ransom note is odd. The ransom amount has been said to be a reference to Psalm 118 and SBTC victory, possibly saved by the cross. Let's have victory over this situation. Psalm 118 is also about deliverance. And think about the ransom note and someone needing to be delivered from that situation. Anyway, let's face it, the Ramseys were ultimately victorious in terms of the story. Patsy may have felt that they were delivered from evil, that they were literally led out of Egypt, that Egypt being bolder, by God. Number 3, Housekeeper recognized Patsy's handwriting. She goes on to write, and this is, I think we need an ominous boom here. She goes on to write, that still wasn't all. One of the ways in which Patsy Ramsey would communicate with me was through handwritten notes, which she would leave for me with instructions for various duties around the house that needed my attention. Let's have another ominous boom. In the 14-month period that I worked for the Ramseys, I was left several dozen handwritten notes by Patsy Ramsey. I was quite familiar with her handwriting, and I believe I can recognize it with very little difficulty. Now, so we passed the 11-minute mark. This is usually where short attention spans begin to wane. This is really important that you listen further. So please do concentrate and focus on this handwritten aspect of the ransom note and whether the Ramsey housekeeper recognized it. Now listen to this. She said, I'm quite familiar with Patsy's handwriting and I believe I can recognize it with very little difficulty. So did she? Did she recognize Patsy's handwriting in the ransom note? It's unfortunate that the housekeeper doesn't mention where these notes were typically left, the notes Patsy left for the housekeeper. But from Patsy's own police statement from June 1998, she admitted as much. Haney, and I think you indicated somewhere before that a lot of times you would leave things. Patsy, right. Thomas, on the steps there. And I guess is that a reference to the spiral staircase? Then let's go to another section. But if somebody who was around your house regularly, Patsy, they would know that this was the staircase we most frequently used. Interesting, isn't it? The housekeeper goes on to write, I told the grand jury that since leaving the employ of the Ramseys, I had occasion to see a copy of the ransom note found at the scene of John Benet Ramsey's murder. We need a big boom here, big booming noise. It was heartbreaking for me to admit that the handwriting in the ransom note looked very much like the handwriting Patsy Ramsey used in writing her notes to me, right? Not it looked similar, looked very much. Then she goes on to write, by way of example, Patsy made her letter A's very distinctively, and she would use accents over words like John Benet and attaché, and often used initialing of words in combination to name just a few of her many unique handwriting characteristics. When she talks about initialing of words, think about the SBTC at the end. Number 4, Patsy wrote the note, therefore she is the killer. Now, I think that is one of the mistakes the Ramsey housekeeper made. She got very excited about recognizing elements in the ransom note and then drew a conclusion which I believe to be a little bit rash. She writes, because I once felt very close to Patsy Ramsey and regarded her with almost as much affection as a member of my immediate family, it has been hard for me to admit that I am now certain that the handwriting in the ransom note looks to me as if it was made by one and the same person, Patsy Ramsey. That is why I'm convinced Patsy killed and then covered up the death of her daughter. She alone is responsible. Number 5, the housekeeper believed John had no choice but to go along with Patsy. And so this is where the housekeeper continues speculating in terms of her theory. She writes, quote, John may have helped her to hide her crime. Why? Because he had no choice, especially since she could have pointed the finger of guilt at him if he had resisted. And this does raise a very interesting question. If this isn't an intruder-type scenario, then whose idea was the ransom note? Whose idea was this crazy 3-page note? Who took the leadership position in writing it? Who called the shots? Who made the decisions? who contributed to the content of the note. Was it just one person or two? And then she ends off saying, perhaps I'm being too cryptic, so let me tell you how I believe JonBenet was murdered. And we'll deal with that in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.